Milé kolegyně a kolegové, po krátké přestávce mi tedy dovolte, abych uvedla další bod na našem programu a tím bude vystoupení pana kolegy Klause Zieglera, konferenčního tlumočníka z němčiny a španělštiny. On je současně konzultant a pedagog a dlouholetý člen Mezinárodní asociace konferenčních tlumočníků AIIC. Je také koordinátorem AIIC pro technické a zdravotní záležitosti. Je zástupcem AIIC také v příslušném výboru Mezinárodní organizace pro normalizaci ISO a projektovým vedoucím norem o simultánním tlumočení a o platformách pro simultánním tlumočení na dálku. A dnes tedy bude hovořit právě o simultánním tlumočení na dálku. Mr. Ziegler, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Welcome to everybody, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm very pleased, and it's a great honor for me to be able to talk to you today on remote simultaneous interpreting, remote interpreting in general. I will give you some more details on the content of my presentation in just a second. I will share my screen with you. Okay, so here we go. Okay, here we are. Yes, so the topic for today is remote simultaneous interpreting. I was asked to give you some information, some basic information about remote simultaneous interpreting, talk a little about the current status, the challenges, and also the opportunities that RSI includes for interpreters in general. There was already been made a short presentation on my own person, but here you have some additional data, which is only to make you aware of the fact that I'm having a look at RSI from very different perspectives. Being myself a freelance conference interpreter since 1992, but also being someone who had the privilege to teach in a course for conference interpreters in Munich in Germany. And basically what brings us together today is my quality or my activity as coordinator of the Technical and Health Committee of AIIC. I also want to point out that I'm a part-time employee of a company that delivers AV services, including also RSI services, just to complete the picture without this being any kind of publicity for this company today. This brings me to a short disclaimer. Everything that I will be showing you now is basically based on material which is available on AIIC websites. It is publicly available websites or also information provided to our Technical Health Committee by manufacturers or providers of simultaneous interpreting equipment, as well as providers of the simultaneous interpreting delivery platforms. I'm not being paid for this presentation or parts of it by any stakeholder, except for a small fee that the organizers are paying me today, which I very much welcome. And any evaluation of technical solutions, business models, etc., which I will be commenting on during this presentation and also during the Q&A session we will be having afterwards, represents exclusively my own personal opinion. Now, a short overview on the topics that I will be covering today. I will give you a very short introduction into what remote interpreting is in general. I will talk about technical setups without going into the technical details. I will talk about the relevant ISO standards in this context as we have them on the market or as they are being developed right now. I will shortly touch upon the technical requirements for remote simultaneous interpreting, and I will give you some very short information on the acoustic shocks in topic. but I will basically be pointing out where you will find additional information on this. I will also talk about platforms, but this in a very, very short way only, because it's not about making a training on platforms or really showing all the details of different platforms today, but just giving you some basic information on those. And then, of course, in the end, I would very much welcome your questions. The questions will be put to me directly. These are the questions that you are entering in Slido, so please make use of this, and we will then hopefully have the possibility to touch upon these different questions. Now, to begin with, it's a slide that I always like to show because it needs to be clear for all of us where remote interpreting, and specifically remote simultaneous interpreting, is being located in the whole context of what we call distance interpreting, which includes also the modality where we as interpreters would be sitting on site, having a direct view of the participants. Something that, of course, these days is basically non-existent in many of our countries due to Corona, but of course, it is still there in theory, and we hope that it will also be part of our practical future again. So we are talking about remote interpreting only in those cases where we as an interpreter do not have any direct view of the participants. This next slide maybe makes it a little bit clearer even. We talk about who is remote actually. And if it's the interpreter who is remote, who is acting remotely, then we talk about remote interpreting with the two varieties, which could be video remote interpreting if there is a video input, a video feed, or a audio remote interpreting if there was only the audio signal available, which of course is not our preferred modality. The focus of my presentation today is definitely on conference interpreting, because that's where I come from and that is where I have the most experience. I can also give you some information, of course, on other settings where remote interpreting is being used quite frequently these days. But the focus, as I say, will be on conference interpreting, although we can deduce a lot of it for other settings just as well. Now, some short information on the technical setups, as I said before, without going into technical details, because that is what we want to be dealing with in a specific seminar, which hopefully can be held by the end of April in Prague directly. So I will limit myself to just giving you some very basic information on the technicalities of remote simultaneous interpreting. The basic thing is that we are talking about digital systems in this context. And as these systems are digital, they allow for very different setups from interpreters working from their office, home office. I don't like very much this concept of home office, but actually that's where many of us are being forced to work in these days. It includes also interpreting from hubs or studios, as they are called, but it would also cover the situation where we as interpreters would be sitting in a room next door to where the original event takes place. Again, something that these days is not very frequent, but we all hope that this will come back in the future. The important thing in this context really is to mention that every situation you might find is different, and every single stakeholder that is involved, which would be the client, which would be a technical provider, which will be consultant interpreters organizing teams of interpreters, or the individual interpreter, will have to decide on the appropriate setup for his or her purposes, for that specific communicative event we are talking about. It it is often or RSI has often been seen as something that is the same no matter what the conditions are, but definitely this is not the case. And I can tell you from also from my technical experience on a daily basis that for every single event, you again will have to think about what would be the real best approach for making communication happen under the given circumstances. Now, there is something that in technical terms that we would call a so-called closed system, which is going back really to the old days where we were all sitting at the same venue, all speakers, participants, and also interpreters being there on site. And the fact why, or the reason why I'm showing you this is only to make you understand that within such a closed system, all the components that would be in use would directly be connected with each other via direct cables. This is actually the basic fact there, which allows you to achieve a much higher reliability, but also quality of transmission of data between those different components. Now, what we then had as an additional step was a so-called semi-open system, which would include not making use only of direct connections between the components, but having to go through a server system and connecting through that server system all the different parties that are involved. And this is also the first time that you would see the concept of an interpreting hub appearing in such a context, because that is exactly what is being made happen or possible due to the use of a server system. And then the next steps in this technical context would be not having only direct transmission of data between those different participants, but really going through a cloud also. That's why the clouds appear here. It would still be an internal server system, but there is transmission of data through a cloud, which makes things a little bit more complicated from the technical point of view, and which makes a difference if you see it. Now, what we have nowadays, what our daily work is about, and when we talk about platforms, is the solution per se, is to work with so-called open systems, where basically everything, every data, every content is being shared through a cloud-based system. This, of course, gives you much more flexibility. You can easily connect participants from very different parts of the world, but it definitely it includes some major challenges when it comes to transmitting the data to that cloud and taking it out from the cloud again in order to make it available for participants or for interpreters just as well. Two more slides on the technical side, just to give you the full picture. This is something that we, in the past, we were calling a hybrid setup, and which still is a hybrid setup, which is being used nowadays. Interpreters for simultaneous interpreting, possibly sitting in a booth and making use of the traditional hardware consoles, interpreter consoles. But as this is a hybrid setup, you would also have the transmission of the data in the background, not through direct wires to the components, but making use again of a cloud, however that cloud is being configured, and making by this available the signals for participants on the one hand, but also the signals coming from a speaker for the interpreters. And the next step that was made then, and that's our reality today, basically is that the interpreter consoles, unless you were working in a hub with a full technical equipment and full technical support, these consoles would be replaced by laptops, PCs, computers, however you want to call them. And the same goes also for the side where the speaker is being located. So everything is being decentralized, everything is being transmitted through a cloud and made available as signals to all the parties involved. So much for the technicalities. Again, I would like to point out that we hopefully will have the possibility to share more information, more technical information during the seminar, which shall be held in April next year. A very important aspect in this whole context are standards. Standards that are being developed and standards that are being used in the, let's say, the language industry, the interpreting industry as such, which is not a new thing, but it has become much more important due to the new technologies that are being used nowadays. I included in this presentation a very short overview on the relevant standards when we talk about simultaneous interpreting. These are, again, all standards related to simultaneous interpreting. The fact that there are other modes of interpreting as well, of course, which also need to be addressed, did not yet fully gain an own dynamic on the ISO level or the standards level in general, but there are a couple of projects going on. For example, one specific standard that is has just been developed for the remote interpreting in consecutive mode. What you see here is a list of the ones available for simultaneous interpreting. I hope that these are known because they really include some very useful information if you want to address interpreting and remote interpreting in the very first place, which brings us together today. The very last one in this list is the so-called ISO PAS 2419, which is on simultaneous interpreting delivery platforms. It is a standard that was published at the beginning of this year, and it really includes the requirements and recommendations for the use of simultaneous interpreting delivery platforms. As I said, it was published in January of this year, and it has become the reference document for the industry. Many organizations, many companies, many clients, but also the technical providers are using this as a reference for making available remote simultaneous interpreting. When I say that it has only been published in January of this year, I immediately have to say that this standard is already being revised by now for the simple fact that for the first edition, we chose at the ISO level to publish it as a so-called publicly available specification, which is not really a full standard, but more a kind of technical specification. What is it about? I don't want to read this out. I think the important aspect is that you will really find the requirements and recommendations for the use of those platforms for the situations where the interpreters are not at in the same room or at the same venue as participants and speakers at a communicative event. In the presentation, you will also see what let's say the different topics that are being covered in this ISO 2419. I would really recommend to all of you to have a look at it and to get familiar with the basic concepts that are being dealt with in this standard. As I said before, we are already working on the revision of that technical specification, turning it into a full standard. We just last week, we handed in the draft international standard 2419 to ISO, which will then be published. And by that, it will be available to the public. A draft international standard is not yet a full standard, but it is there on the market in order to make people aware of it and to comment on it. The final standard that will be published then will definitely take into account all the comments that will be made in this commenting phase now we are with this project in now. It is supposed to be published by the end of next year, the latest. As we are talking about platforms, I also want to share some information with you on those RSI platforms. Here you see a non-exhaustive overview. It's just to make you understand that there are on the market quite a number of providers of these platforms. Not all of them being really simultaneous interpreting delivery platforms. And this is one of the problems that we are facing on the market right now. Many people are talking about platforms, but they are talking about totally different concepts. So you have to make a difference between what we would rather be calling collaboration tools. These are known without making any promotion for them, but just to make you aware of what we're talking about. If you talk about Microsoft Teams, for example, if you talk about the Skype or these kind of things, these are basically collaboration tools or communication tools, but they are not simultaneous interpreting delivery platforms, for the simple fact that there is a lot missing on those in terms of features, functionalities, especially for the interpreters in order to be able to deliver their services on a high qualitative level. Now, very clearly, we can say, and we have to say this, platforms are what makes a lot of interpreters survive in times of Corona. There are still a number of interpreters who dislike this way of working. Of course, it is different from being on site. It is different from what we were used to in the past. But definitely, we don't have any other choice than to have a look, at least, into those technical solutions, try to get familiar with them, and try to include them in our daily life. I personally think that there is no other choice if we see what the development is like, and if we have a look at the future. I'm definitely convinced of the fact that we will see platforms also being used even after a possibly and hopefully Corona time. It is important to get information about those, to be informed. And what I personally also think it's that interpreters need to be trained with regards to the use of these platforms. And you see here that I put a real training here in addition, for the simple fact that we are seeing on the market a lot of concepts that claim to be kind of certification or training or whatever, which is basically a half-an-hour course in order to be able to handle the application as such. But a real training in order to be able to deliver exactly the same services that you were delivering in the past when you were still working on site, this requires much more than a simple half-an-hour course. There is also something that needs to be mentioned in this context. It is quite critical, or the consequences of the use of platforms or the existence of platforms can be quite critical, because there are some business models there on the market which have very important consequences for interpreters in the very first place. And therefore, I always recommend to have a very critical approach to technologies, to new technologies in general, without from the beginning saying that this can't work or that it doesn't work, because that's simply also not true. Definitely, platforms still need to improve if they want to deliver the same quality, and I'm talking basically about audio quality and video quality, as the ISO 21109 compliant interpreting systems. There is a lot of improvement that we can observe, and there are constantly being made some changes, some modifications, some improvements, but still we are not on the same level as it would be having a interpreting system directly wired and being in use on site. We, as AIIC Technical and Health Committee, we made a very first, we called it by then technical study, although it was not a real study. It was just having a look at how those platforms were behaving We by then had to see or could observe that none of the solutions that were available by that time were fully compliant with the basic requirements for simultaneous interpreting as we would find them in the ISO standards. Some of them were claiming to be close, yes, definitely, and they still do. But still, we don't see that any of those platforms would be really fully compliant. It's another question whether this needs to be a full compliance or not. I don't want to go into this discussion at this time now. We also had audio was being muted, not by myself. Okay, here I am again with you, I hope at least. Someone muted my microphone and took away my video. Now, we as AIIC, we did a new round of tests with the SIDP platforms. Basically, we commissioned it to audio engineers, and this test was carried out just a couple of days ago on October 26th. And we are very much looking forward to getting the results. I was hoping to be able to give you some results today already, but unfortunately we did not receive the documentation from the audio engineers yet. So more on this hopefully in the near future. When we talk about those platforms, as I said before, we have to talk about some basic requirements that are important in the context of simultaneous interpreting. And we talk about audio and video quality in the very first place. Again, I don't want to go into details on the different technicalities of those requirements, but just mention some of them, which are frequency response, which is related to the behavior of headphones and of microphones. We talk about latency. How long does it take for data to be transmitted from where they are being generated at the source until they get to the interpreter, and then from the interpreter and his delivery back to an audience or to an audience? That's what latency is about. Speech intelligibility is a very important and very interesting aspect in this whole context. There have been a lot of discussions on social media and in the course of seminars that are being held all around the world on, let's say, the fidelity of the speech transmission. I personally think that speech intelligibility is something that we will have to look much more into in the future in order to really make an evaluation of platforms and of the transmission of data. Lip synchronization is definitely also important in order to give the interpreter possibility to work accordingly, and image quality, of course, also. But more on these things, hopefully in April, be it on-site or be it maybe again in an online format. Just to pick out some very small pieces of information of this technical part. I'm often being asked, why are frequencies important? What happens if I use a headset or a headphone with more or less frequency than the one indicated in the ISO standards? I think it's very simple. If you have more frequency response than the one that is required, you might be hearing undesired sounds. So at the lower end and at the upper end, you might be hearing something that is being caused, for example, by electrical systems, a very low frequent noise that they are constantly producing due to their functioning. And this all of a sudden you would be hearing. On the other hand, if you have less frequency response than the one that is required, you might simply not be hearing enough. So what you get is what you hear. And what you don't get, you won't be able to hear it and to process it as an interpreter. Of course, again, I have to stress on the fact that RSI includes different stakeholders, not only interpreters, of course, but you will have AV providers at all the ends that are connected to a virtual meeting, for example. It includes rental companies who are renting their equipment for hubs, for example, or for hybrid events where still a part of the event is taking place somewhere. And of course, also there, you need to take care of the basic requirements. Platform providers, I think this goes without saying. Hub providers also need to take into account those. I will come back to the hub concept a little bit later. And of course, interpreters and speakers and so on. Everyone needs to assume his or her responsibility in this whole game. Let me say a few words about what AIIC is doing on distance interpreting as a general approach, but also on remote simultaneous interpreting specifically. As I already mentioned before, there was this technical study in 2019, which was basically on these parameters that you find here on this slide, which I already mentioned before. It also included hearing protection, which is one of the widely discussed topics in the whole context for very good reasons, of course. By that time, as I said before, none of the platforms were fully compliant. And one of the things that we found out is that none of those platforms included any measures for hearing protection, which led to a discussion on how can we as interpreters protect ourselves against the possibly harmful effects of the use of not only platforms, but in general terms, equipment, because the hearing protection is something that you would also need if you were working as an interpreter on site with equipment. We also carried out in this context a joint project with the Translation Bureau in Canada, which is basically the organization that organizes and delivers the whole interpreting services for the government in Canada. And together with our colleagues from AIIC Canada, we did some tests with hearing protection devices. Basically, it was meant to raise awareness and to promote a stronger consideration of hearing protection amongst all the parties involved. There was also a very interesting research project that was carried out on acoustic shocks, which is one of the aspects that is widely being discussed. And if you want to get more information on that, I would kindly invite you to have a look on YouTube. Just look for this AIIC research project on acoustic shocks, or for the spotlight on interpreting research. You will get a lot of very useful information having a look at this and watching this video, which includes also the presentation of the results of the study. By the way, it was quite alarming to see how many interpreters that participated in the survey were commenting that they had felt symptoms that might be due to having suffered an acoustic shock. So definitely something that we should not neglect in this whole context. What else is there from AIIC side as an association representing the interests of conference interpreters worldwide? A whole lot of different documents that were produced specifically for COVID times, for how that give you guidance on how to deal with it. Again, here we can't go into details on the different subjects, but you will see the link here where you will find those guidelines, which you can access there. Unfortunately, and this is also part of this slide, you will find there some information which is outdated and which needs to be taken off the AIIC website as a link. We are working on that. The ones that had the chance to have a look at the AIIC websites in the past couple of weeks and months will have noticed that we had a change of the whole hosting, the whole website presentation, and unfortunately some of the information got lost. Some of the links didn't work. We are hardly working on re-establishing this in order to make everyone aware and able to make use of our information. The hearing protection I already mentioned before. Also here, just 2 or 3 more sentences about this. Where does this come from, and where can you find information on what is relevant in this context? We have the ISO standard 2109 on simultaneous interpreting equipment, and there you find a specific clause on hearing protection. And you will see 2 different approaches to this, one being the approach that you should be warned if the volume that you are receiving, the sound level that you are receiving as interpreter, is too high for a longer period of time. And the other, the second aspect which is relevant, possibly even more relevant due to the effects this can have, is peaks that are being transmitted through a system, very loud peaks that could be harmful for your ear. And also here you find the values, and technically savvy people will know what this is about. And for the others, I really recommend to get in touch with whoever your provider is and make sure that you are on the safe side with the protection you have. A very easy way of protecting yourself is by making use of interpreter consoles that are ISO 2109 compliant. We know that not everywhere in the world these are being used, but that would be one possibility. The other possibility is making use of a mixing console, an audio mixer, which can also guarantee hearing protection, but only if it is properly set. Usually that is being done by technical people, technical staff. But nowadays, as we are working, many of us are working from home, we have to take care of that ourselves, as the platforms are not delivering that protection by now. There are different possibilities for doing so. You can also use an audio mixer yourself where you are, but you really need to know how to handle this. And let's be honest, we are not technicians, we are no audio engineers. So this is not that easy as it might sound in the beginning. There are also some solutions for having kind of a last line of defense, which would be including the hearing protection device in your headphones, for example, or connecting a device between your PC, laptop you're using and your headphones. But also this is quite tricky. They need to be properly calibrated and set, otherwise they simply won't work. And the worst thing that can happen is that you rely on a device that in the end doesn't give you the protection that you really need. There's a lot that still needs to be studied and done on this chapter. So remain vigilant, ask for protection, and report incidents if they occur. And an incident doesn't necessarily mean that you really suffer a major incident with your hearing. But even if you notice bad sound quality, disturbing noises, these kind of things, report them, because if we as interpreters do not report them, nobody will be aware of the fact that something is not as it should be. And of course, depending on where you are, it's always your right to refuse to work in an environment that you deem unsafe. This also goes for us as freelance interpreters. We simply need to protect ourselves, so everyone needs to take a decision on that. Coming almost already to the end, I will just say a few words about hubs, because this is also a concept that is being used quite frequently nowadays. There are hubs spread all over the world already. They are popping up at different points in different regions. And it is important to know that not everything that is called a hub is the same as a different concept that is also being called a hub. So you would find private offices where you simply have 2 workplaces in the same room, an internet connection, and that's it. the question is whether this is can be considered a hub. The same goes also for people working from their homes with 2 Skype links and calling this a hub and making this available possibly also for colleagues. I would very much recommend to have a closer look at what a hub should definitely be including in order to be called as such. But of course, hub is not a protected concept, so everybody can use it. If we wanted to go for more professional hubs as they are existing throughout the world, we would see that these offer the necessary infrastructure. You have the technical assistance there on site by qualified technicians that help you as an interpreter. And you have some additional services, of course, also that are important in the context of interpreting, like, for example, facilities to get prepared, to have access to the information sources that you are using, etc., etc. You will find a lot of different concepts of those hubs. As I said before, if you just make a Google search, you will get a lot of different information on how a hub can look like, which can be a very easy thing. It can also be something quite sophisticated, as you see it here, which is really a new work environment. It's not a traditional booth anymore. It's a working environment with all the necessary things that you would need. Now, what about the future? Of course, we also have to talk about the future, and everyone is asking him or herself, what will the future bring? What will it look like? Personally, I definitely think that the future will be different from what we had before Corona. It will be a future marked by on-site and remote interpreting. So definitely remote is there to stay, and better get familiar with it in order to not get lost on that track. But the on-site interpreting, I'm also convinced, will be coming back. We will see to which extent, but definitely I see both modalities in high demand in the future. It's very probable that we will have a coexistence of on-site and remote, and the consequences of that, that's the important thing, I think, for us as interpreters as well. We will have to think about new business models. We will have to think about new working environments. We will have to think about new challenges, maybe different activities also for the associations representing interpreters and their interests. So it's very interesting to see what happens in the future. We should not, in my humble opinion, be afraid of that future, but accept it as something that really forces us to step out of our comfort zones and to really try to be as open-minded as possible in order to be able to keep on playing in the future in that, let's say, interpreting game. I think without making use of new technologies, it will definitely be very, very difficult for us as interpreters to survive. So that's my final statement. Try to see this crisis as an opportunity. Get familiar with the possibilities that are out there. Be critical, yes, of course, but try not to be too reluctant in order to get prepared for that future. So that would be my presentation so far. And now I would very much welcome your questions. I will stop sharing my screen with you right now and go for answering your questions. I got a first question, which is a very typical question, of course, that many of us are asking themselves: how to deal with poor incoming sound from speakers. It is a major challenge, of course, we know, and it is very, very difficult to convince speakers from the necessity of using appropriate equipment. Personally, I had I don't know if I want to call this a privilege, but I did have a lot of, or I'm constantly having talks with with speakers, very high level speakers at company level, at organization level. In the beginning, they are quite reluctant to wearing something like a headset, for example. But if you have the chance to talk to them before, not of course one day before the meeting or just when the meeting starts, but you have to do this well before, there is a possibility of making them understand that in the end, it's not only you as an interpreter who will not be able to perform as you would like to, but it is also the speaker himself who will be losing content, who will not be able to transmit his content as he would like to, for the simple fact that the interpretation will not be possible as it should be. So yes, it's difficult. I would recommend having a set of, let's say, guidelines for speakers ready that you can always send out to your clients well before an event taking place, to include them in the negotiations with organizations on different levels, and really try to make people understand that this is vital for a quality service. Again, as I said, we know it's not an easy task. There is a standard, a project on a standard on online consecutive interpretation. This is true, yes, that's what I said. It is a German standard, and we will, or we have already finished the content, and it will be published right now as a draft German standard. By this, it will be made available to the larger public so everyone can see it and can comment on it. And the comments we are receiving in that phase will then, of course, also be considered when it comes to finalizing and publishing the final standard. More information on that can be found on the websites of the German National Standards Institute, the DIN. I did not check whether you are already able to see that, that standard and to comment on it. But I can check this again, and I can make this through the association. I can make available the link to it. Then there is a question about signed language interpreting. It's a very good question, because indeed, this is something that is being discussed on very different levels at nearly every single event that is taking place these days. It is important, absolutely, to consider signed language interpreting in the whole context of these new technologies and these new modalities. There are, of course, specific challenges that need to be considered. In terms of, if you take a very simple example, if you take the video quality, the video is vital in order to being able to provide sign language interpreting services. Whereas when we work, or when I work as an interpreter with my languages, with my spoken languages, of course, the main thing is the audio and its quality. Although the video adds a lot in terms of content to what I'm hearing, and makes it much, much easier for me to understand and to really get what the speaker is trying to transmit. But for sign language interpreting, it is absolutely vital to have the video. So there are some major challenges in the context of this. We just had a quite interesting discussion in the experts group that is developing the ISO standard, the revised ISO 24019 as a full standard, where we included signed language interpreting, but where we still need to find the right balance between what making mandatory and what addressing as things that need to be considered when you talk about a communicative event. The major problem being that not all of the events will be with sign language interpreting. On the other hand, if a platform, for example, doesn't offer sign language interpreting features, specific sign language interpreting features, then this platform cannot be used if even on short notice, someone would depend on sign language interpretation at this event. So that's where we will have to find the right balance. There are a couple of challenges that need to be addressed there. I think we already are quite far with this chapter, but still there is a lot of also research that needs to be done in order to be able to say something about this in the future and to find the adequate solutions. Yes, these were the questions that I got through the chat so far. I don't know if there are more questions for me at this time. Maybe you could just give me some information.
No, I'm just checking, and I can see that there are no other questions. So thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and I hope that we will have the opportunity to meet next year in April here in Prague, hopefully.
Absolutely. Thank you very much again for having me with you today, and I would really love to be in Prague next year. And definitely, if you have any questions in the meantime, do not hesitate to get in touch with me. This goes for everyone that sees this presentation now or that listens to this presentation. Get in touch with us both at AIIC level, but also on a personal level. And I will try to do my very best in order to help interpreters get through these difficult times and getting better prepared for the future that is waiting there for us. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you. Vážení kolegové, s panem kolegou Zieglerem my se budeme snažit zorganizovat na příští rok, 24. dubna, celodenní školení. Už je to na webových stránkách JTP, takže tam se můžete podívat na podrobnosti, tedy zase se to bude týkat tlumočení na dálku, akustiky a těchto přidružených témat spojených se s novinkami současné doby.